Before I went into ceremony in Peru, my wife Zaira asked me, "What energizes you?" And I think it's this right here. It's going on a journey. And so, what is this right here? This is my Sermon on the Mount. So, once a week, I hike up to the top of this mountain and I share my thoughts like I'm doing right now. And I love it because I love so much spending that time going inward, being one with God, learning, discovering things about myself, about the world, and then sharing that with all of you. And then at the end of the day, going back to my family and sharing it with them and the way I show up. And so today, I want to talk about a few things I recently learned, a few things that changed the way I see the world. So who remembers Y2K? Who remembers the millennium, year 2000? I mean, what a big deal it was. Will Smith had the hit song. We all thought the world was going to crash because of the Y2K bug. And what I recently learned is, I kind of knew this all along, but the year 2000 was important. It was significant for our computer systems. But in the grand scheme of history, it really was just an arbitrary number. The year 2000 didn't really mean anything. There's not a lot connected to why we started counting and celebrating that year the way we did. Now, some people may say, well, it's 2000 AD, 2000 years after the death of Jesus. Yes, that's what it's supposed to be, but it's not. It's not. There's a whole lot of debate about when did Jesus actually die. But the leading theory is that he died in the year AD 30 on April 7th. And that's because of the dates of Passover and the way they align with the calendar and a few other things. And I just discovered this, right? So if you go with that leading theory, and there's a range of time, right? Some people say maybe as early as 26 AD, up to as late as 36 AD. But generally, the kind of best historical guess estimate is that April 7th of the year 30 is when Jesus died. Now, I think that's fascinating because April 7th is my birthday. And it's also fascinating because if he ministered for 3 years, more or less, then really this upcoming year is when he would have started his ministry 2,000 years ago. So somewhere between the years 26 and 27, more or less, maybe 28, is when he most likely began following John the Baptist and started his ministry. And April 7th of the year 30, which is right around the corner, that's like less than 4 years away, is the millennium, the millennial. And I think that's fascinating. I don't know if I was an apocalyptic preacher like Jesus was, and Jesus was a preacher about the imminent apocalypse, maybe I would think that there's some significance, and maybe everything that's happening in the world is leading us to something dire on the 2,000-year anniversary of his death. I don't necessarily think that, but if you read the news, man, oh man, all the things going on may lead you to believe that. So let's talk about a man that lived in the first century, that had a group of devout followers that could heal people from a distance, heal people from miles away just by thinking about them, could heal them, that could raise people from the dead. Isn't that amazing? And now you maybe think that I'm talking about Jesus, but I'm not. I am not talking about Jesus. I'm talking about the Greek mystic and philosopher Apollonius. I'll put his name in the notes. But you may be surprised to know that in the first century, there was a healer that could heal people, raise them from the dead, and did all the same miracles that Jesus is claimed to have done. And Jesus's followers and this other mystic's followers most likely crossed paths multiple times. And it's fascinating because I can imagine conversations where this Greek mystics followers are saying, well, you don't know what Adonis did. He raised people from the dead. And then the Christians would be like, Lazarus, Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. And you can imagine a world where these stories kind of got conflated, and where people on both sides felt the need to outprove each other to the other, to show that their deceased leader was greater and more powerful. And you have to think that around the same time too, Greek philosophy and theology was still really strong. Stories like Hercules, that were born to a woman and son of a god, were still really popular stories. And so if early Christians were trying to convert pagans to their belief, you can imagine that coming up with a story that Jesus was born to a virgin and that his father was God itself, you can imagine that that story would have been beneficial to share in order to help convert these Greek and other pagans over to this new religion called Christianity. And now look, the things I want to talk about today may trigger the nervous system of some people. And I don't mean to say that anything that you or they believe is wrong. I'm merely saying, or will say, what my beliefs are and share some things that I've learned through my study of the historical figure of Jesus. And so what does that story include? There's a great Audible book I just finished. It's called The Historical Jesus by Dr. Ehrman. Wonderful college lecture type series. I think it's 24 lectures, really good Audible book. And then this other book I'm reading is Jesus, or the Historical Figure of Jesus, similar title, slightly different, by Sanders. Both of them take a pretty similar approach. And there's so much I wish I could share here. I think really what these books and audiobooks showed me, though, is that lots of the things we think we know about Jesus are, I won't say wrong, because I don't think that's the right word. Maybe not, maybe a better way to say it is, very often there's not a lot of historical evidence to prove or disprove what traditional Christian beliefs are. And I'm specifically talking about the beliefs of like Jesus being born in Bethlehem, him being raised from the dead, him performing miracles, him raising other people from the dead. And here's a good example. I already talked about, I mentioned that the Gospels don't even agree on which day Jesus died, right? The oldest Gospel, the book of Mark, which most people say Matthew, Mark, and Luke are kind of the most historically accurate, says he died on the day before Passover. No, the day of Passover. And then the book of John changes it to the day before Passover. And there's reasons why that may be the case. People may say, oh, well, it's one day off. What difference does it make? Well, people say that John is different from the other three Gospels because John takes a more theological approach. And if you read the book of John and compare it to the other three, they are completely different books, completely different. The stories are different. The things Jesus said is different. It's like, if you look at it under like a close eye, you will notice that it's night and day. And most of, let me backtrack. If you start reading with the book of Mark, then you read Matthew and Luke, and then you read John, you will notice that the theology of Jesus changes. And where Matthew, Mark, and Luke are more just about like, hey, this is what he did. He did healing. He was raised from the dead. Yes, it kind of goes into some of those beautiful miracles. But then the book of John really establishes him as the only Son of God, right? The book starts, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was Jesus, or something to that effect. And so it changes the date of his death to coincide with the sacrifice of the lamb the day before Passover. And in the book of John, multiple times, John says that Jesus is a new sacrificial lamb. But the other books don't agree with that. The books that are written earlier don't agree with that. And then we have the books of Paul that come later, the Acts of the Apostles. And then the theology goes even further. Then you have, the earliest beliefs about the Holy Trinity, the Holy Spirit, all this stuff. And all this to say, I think it's all beautiful. There's nothing wrong with any of it. Jesus sacrificed himself for the world. And I think if he knew that people were using his life story and adapting it in order to spread love, I don't think he would have had a lot of offense to that. And I think it's okay if Christ's consciousness changes and adapts over time. Now, that may be difficult for people to believe, some people, but all of us are allowed to grow and adapt and learn. And Jesus' life was cut short, but if he was still alive, I'm sure that he would have continued to adapt and learn over his life. And in his afterlife, I think it's okay if Christ's consciousness continues to grow based upon the needs of the world. Assuming that isn't used in malicious ways to hurt people, which unfortunately has been in the past. But I digress. Here's again, this book. We all know there's 12 disciples, widely accepted, pretty much, fact that there were 12 disciples. Who were they? Well, first off, the most well-known, Simon, also known as Peter, also known as Cephas. Why does he have 3 names? That's an odd point. Most people didn't have 3 names in historical times, but that's besides the point. Then you got Andrew, James, John, Philip, Thomas, Judas Iscariot, the traitor, Bartholomew, Matthew, James, son of Alphaeus, Simon, Thaddeus, Judas, son of the James, different Judas, Nathaniel, and sometimes Levi the tax collector. That was 14 or 15 names. If you read the Gospels do not agree on who the 12 disciples were. And you would think that that's like something that they should just get right off the bat, but they don't. Where am I going with all this? Why was Jesus important? And I think a better question is, why are so many young people turning away from Christianity? And I think the reason is because most of the past 2,000 years, church has been preaching that we should follow Jesus because of his divinity, because he performed miracles, because he raised people from the dead, because he was born of a Virgin Mary, because a star appeared over his manger, because he resurrected on the 3rd day. And we've been told that's why you need to believe in Jesus, because he is this divine miracle person that surpasses all expectations and belief. And many people, like myself, when they start down the path of education and knowledge, they learn and realize, or think, again, if you don't follow this, it's okay, nothing wrong, but they realize that most of those stories are folklore, that Jesus's disciples probably elaborated on his healing, probably came up with stories, probably had psychedelic experiences, either through medicine or without, and imagined and saw visions that weren't really reality. And it would almost be like someone today saying, oh yeah, I pray to Hercules and I give sacrifice to Hercules because Hercules was the son of a god and he had superhuman strength, and I have an altar in my house for Aphrodites, and oh yeah, you should worship her too. You'd be like, what? Like, those are just stories. Those aren't real. Why are you worshiping Greek gods? Those are folk tales. They're not real. And I think much of society has come to realize that about the stories in the Bible. Stories that even the Bible does not agree with. Even different chapters of the Bible tell completely different stories about the same exact events. And there's multiple examples of that. And I think it's time that we go back to the teachings of Jesus as a society and discover what was his real message. And his real message was his commandment. Love one another as I have loved you. Now, some people will say, oh, he had two commandments, love God and love your neighbor. But no, that's not true if you read the Bible. Again, this is all of this is open to interpretation. But in the Bible, someone asks him, what's the greatest laws? And he says, love God, love your neighbor, which were laws from the old Jewish Testament. But then later he says, my one commandment is love one another as I have loved you. And I could go on about this, but I think what Jesus did by, in one point saying, hey, these two commandments, love God, love your neighbor, and then later saying, love God as I have loved you, I believe that in his life, Jesus realized that loving God and loving your neighbor were the same exact thing. And that if you love God, you have to love God in all the ways that him, she, or it shows up in this world, including loving your neighbor. And so to love God is to love your neighbor, and to love your neighbor is to love God. And so when Jesus says love God or love your neighbor as I have loved you, how did he love us? He saw us and he loved us because he sees and saw God within us. And when Jesus says the golden rule, which is not a commandment, but the golden rule is what we call it, which is love your neighbor as you love yourself. He wants us to love our neighbor and see God in them, and to love ourselves and see God within ourselves the same way. And that's it. And it's beautiful. And I can go on and on about that because I think it's so powerful. I think all of us don't just have a piece of God in us, but we are God. We are God. God exists in us fully and completely. And when you go back to Jesus's message, his core teaching of love, for me, I've realized that that's where his power comes from. That is why we still talk about Jesus 2,000 years later. Isn't because of the miracles. It's not because he was resurrected. It's not because he raised people from the dead. It's not because of any of that folklore. Yes, those are good children's stories. They were necessary to carry his story along. But for me, none of that means anything. It's beautiful, but for me, the reason I love Jesus as a teacher, the reason I carry his message is because for me, his power is in his message, not in the miracles, which are most likely folktale. It's in the message to love one another as I have loved you, and to love yourself the same way. And the imminent apocalypse that he also preached, I'll save that for a different sermon. I love you. thank you for being here on the top of the mountain with me.